Well, the book is about my spiritual quest, essentially. It's a memoir, and the events in it really begin with my trip to India. One of the key moments in my life was when I learned transcendental meditation, which I've been practicing for many, many years, and it has been the mainstay of my life. And the book, although it begins with the trip to India, everything that preceded it was part of it. The book is called Awakened because it's about the central experience that I had in India, which was being brought to the edge of all of my boundaries, of all of my resources, of all of my strength, and collapsing essentially into the fullness of God. It was, getting there was not easy, and I think that in my case it was necessary to go through those steps. It was, kind of like a little rougher than the peeling away of layers of an onion, but it was just stripping away all of the things that I used to, all of the things that I knew as familiar, all of the ways that I identified with myself. And this was all tied in with the sleeping on the rooftop and the beetles, and I got very sick and I was freezing and I was in terrible pain. But through all of that, I ultimately had the experience on a night which I only found out the next morning was a night when one of the highest initiations that can be given was given by Swami Sachchidananda. And at that point, I felt that everything that I was completely dropped away. I was gone and only God was. And it was, it's very difficult to put into words, which I guess is why I tried to write about it. It's in a way, it was easier for me to write about than to talk about. And I felt that it was important to write about it because I think this is what we're all striving for. And I have benefited greatly from reading about other people's experiences on the spiritual path. And so I wanted to make anything that was useful from my experiences available to others. Well, I was raised Catholic. I'm Irish descent, and my grandmother, who was wonderful and very Catholic, was, she actually may have been the initial introduction for me to the saints. I remember once she came in and said goodnight, and she said, "Have you prayed to St. Anthony tonight?" And I said, "No, I don't really know St. Anthony." And she said, "You don't know St. Anthony?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Come over here." She said, "St. Anthony, this is my granddaughter. I'd like you to meet her. Granddaughter Michael, this is St. Anthony." And so that was a bit of the combination of the traditional Catholicism with Irish overtones. So that may have set the stage for my interest in saints and my expectation that it might be amusing and warm and all of the things one associates with a loving grandmother. Whereas with my grandmother, the saints were very much alive and very present in her life, the traditional view in Catholicism is that someone is only made a saint after they're dead, and there are certain steps and proofs that have to be established. And when I became interested in and involved in Indian and Eastern religion, Hinduism specifically, and learned that saints are very much alive, according to the Hindu tradition, that was an extraordinarily joyous revelation, made more joyous when I actually met some of them. And I remember one of the first saints I met was Ammachi, the hugging saint, and a friend for a few years had been saying, wouldn't you like to come and meet this Indian saint? She's coming to Dallas. And I thought, saint, harumph. And, but I did eventually go, and to make a long story short, there's not a cell in my body that doubts the divinity, the saintliness of Ammachi. I also went to see Mother Mira, who lives in a little town in Germany, and she's actually the first saint I went to see. She's said to give darshan through her photograph, and someone gave me a book of hers for Christmas that had a photograph of her, and it seemed to be working on me, or so I believed. And I went to see her in Germany with a group of people from the meditation community here where I live. And everything with Mother Mira is done in complete silence. People file in silence, they sit in silence, and she comes down into the group, sits in a chair, and then when people feel it's the right moment for them, they go up to her and kneel before her, and she touches their head and works on these very fine lines that are invisible to us, but said to be visible to saints, that go up the spine and indicate almost like a thermometer where a person is in their spiritual development. And she does what is extraordinarily delicate surgery to untie any knots or any blocks in the person's spiritual evolution. Well, darshan is being in the presence of a holy person or a saint. And usually people who seek darshan do so in order to receive the blessings of the holy person. And one form, in my view, probably the most important form of the blessing that is received is that one feels probably the closest experience the closest experience I have had to enlightenment has been when in the presence of a holy person. And I've read that the explanation for this is that a person who is enlightened is completely full. And just as when one is in nature, there's a feeling of fullness that spills over from nature and fills the soul, something comparable happens in the presence of a saint. Jung said that apparently Jung ended up in a hospital in India. He got sick, Carl Jung this is, and he said that it was a blessed island in a sea of new impressions. So I think that kind of captures a bit of the intensity of the novelty of the whole culture. I think the main thing that made the trips uncomfortable was the absence of chairs. I think for a Westerner who's not accustomed to sitting cross-legged on the floor, it can be quite excruciating. Not if it's for 10 or 15 minutes, but if it's for 8 or 10 hours a day, day after day, it's a challenge. And I think that for people who've grown up, for example, in India and have been sitting on the floor since they were children, they must have different joints or differently relaxed, developed muscles, and I definitely did not have those. So that was part of it. And the other part that was difficult physically was that during I would say the highest point of the whole experience, I was actually sleeping on a rooftop out in the cold. It's hard to imagine that India is cold, but for me it was freezing. And I only had a light blanket, and during the first night I remember I was exhausted and I put my head down to have the balm and the anesthesia of sleep, and I put my head into a nest of beetles. There were hundreds of them. And so that was a bit of the flavor. And the next morning, while I was meditating up on the rooftop, monkeys came to visit, and I was terrified. So you'd think someone meditating would not have such terror, but part of India that's a challenge, I think, to people who are there for the first time is just the novelty and the culture shock. I should say, you know, the description that I gave about being up on the rooftop, that was for a very short period of time. It was about a week, and it was at the birthplace of Swamiji, Sachchidananda, Ganapati, whom I had gone to visit. And his ashram actually is quite extraordinarily beautiful, with beautiful architecture, beautiful buildings, an exquisite music hall that it was so moving that I was practically in tears the first time I saw it. Very, very different from a typical Western music concert hall, but extraordinary. And it was designed by Swamiji. So that part of the ashram, which was where I spent most of my time, was perfectly comfortable. I stayed in what was called Angel Hall, which was a dormitory for Westerners, and it was called Angel Hall because Swamiji said that the Westerners were like angels because they came in these airplanes and flew all the way to India to be there, and that was perfectly comfortable. The uncomfortable part was during a Kriya Yoga course that was in a place called Meghadattu, which was the birthplace of Swamiji, and that was indeed uncomfortable. My feeling in retrospect is that it was specifically designed that way in order to help those of us who participated to go beyond our boundaries, and it certainly did that. Some people have asked why I sought out such uncomfortable situations, and the fact of the matter is that I didn't seek it out at all. In fact, when I first went to India, my notion of India and the quest for enlightenment was like a cross between a Hallmark card and a Clairol ad of someone floating through a valley of flowers, and I thought I would get off the plane and instantly be in a state of bliss, and it was not that way at all. I think, though, some people have said that the desire and the actuality of making a trip to India with spiritual intent is in a way giving the universe permission to do whatever needs to be done, however ruthless the surgery needed to help one to move beyond the ego and into a state of greater oneness with God. That actually began with a trip to Sedona to see the saint Karunamayi. And I was there with my adopted Greek daughter whose third eye is extraordinarily open. And while we were there, after we met with Karunamayi for a few hours, I went to sleep and had a very peaceful night. And the next morning I saw her, and this is my daughter, and she looked wretched. And I said, "What is wrong?" And she said, "I've been up all night long. I was receiving messages from the saints, and all of the messages were for you." And I was, of course, quite curious. And I said, "Well, what were the messages?" And she said, "They said the architecture in your house is completely wrong. The energy is all wrong. It's blocked and there's no flow. And they have specific recommendations about tearing out certain walls and putting in skylights and having a bed of rocks located near a specific window." And of course, this sounded quite bizarre to me, but I gave it thought, and I had reason to believe, I just had reason to believe that it came from a high source and that it was true. So I decided to act on it. And in the course of looking for someone to help do the work, I found a wonderful Portuguese man, John Carvalho, who is a genius. I think he's much more of an artist than anything else. And I've heard so many people say that renovating their houses was one of the worst nightmares of their lives. For me, it was one of the most fun, satisfying things in the world, because I was working with this artist, and he had two people who were working with him, and they would put up shelves, and then we would step back and look and see that the corner of the shelf was sticking out through the arch, and he would say to them, "Rip down the shelves." And so nothing was set in stone, everything was fluid, and if it wasn't right, it was removed and it was redone. And then we would get the idea of maybe tiles would be nice, and we'd jump in the car and run and look in different tile shops. And so this behind me, the kitchen, these where there are now arches were solid walls before, and the cabinets that are way up next to the ceiling were down at, you know, a more normal, reachable level that didn't require a ladder initially. And in the center of the house, according to Sthapatya Veda architecture, which is the ancient Indian architecture of creating houses in tune with nature, essentially, the Brahmastan was created, and that's the exact center of the house, which is measured, you know, to find the right spot. And it's designed as the place that should be kept empty, because it's, in my view, it's analogous to the still point in the soul, the point that we come to in meditation. And in this particular one, there's a skylight above so that the energies from above can come through. And of course, I wanted to have Buddha there smiling at me, and saw a statue of Buddha, so put that there. And he's actually out of the space that's designated that needs to be empty, just behind it, looking on. And it's called the Brahmastan because that's where the god Brahma is thought to live. And so the space is left open and protected for Brahma. I don't know that necessary really is the word. You know, it's kind of, if there's a wonderful opera in town, you go to see the opera. If you know they're wonderful saints, you go to see the wonderful saints. A friend of mine who loves to go to saints said that for him it's like a bee going to where the honey is, going for the nectar. And there was a beautiful quote from Vasistha about the holy people. It's actually in the book, so maybe I could read that. I think it's... This is from Yoga Vasistha. The blessings that flow from the company of holy people are incomparable to any other blessing. Even the love and affection that the gods and the angels possess are nothing compared to the limitless love that flows from the holy ones. It is the characteristic of these enlightened ones to raise others to their own level. So I think Vasistha answered your question much better than I could. Of the different saints that I went to see? Oh, that's a hard question. I think I could answer better to tell you what it was that I learned, or in what way each one inspired me. Swamiji, Swami Sachchidananda Ganapati, is very, very strict. He describes himself as a surgeon, spiritual surgeon, and I certainly sensed that from my experiences with him. I also felt and feel that he has taught me some of the most important lessons of this lifetime, and has given me some of the most profound protection, which probably sounds contradictory given what I described about being on the rooftop. But I'll give you one brief example. I was once at home on a Saturday, and I had this strong message from Swamiji: go now. I was planning to do some errands, and I thought to do them later in the afternoon. And I thought, now, why such urgency? And I heard again, go now. So I thought, all right, I've learned not to question when I sense a message from Swamiji. So I got in my car, I began driving, wondering the whole time why. And when I got to Oak Hill, where two highways come together, suddenly I had no brakes whatsoever. And I was headed toward a red light, and I started honking my horn, but it was summertime, and so no one could hear the horn. And just as I got to the red light, the light turned green, and I continued. I was coasting downhill, and I continued going, and I thought, I'm just going to crash into all of these different cars. And I was in a lane one lane over from the embankment. And I saw two large trucks coming, and since I had no power, I could steer, but that was all I could do. And I thought, it's now or never. Either I go now and get over, or I go straight ahead and crash into all of these cars, causing a huge collision. So I turned the wheel, drove over in between two racing huge 18-wheeler trucks, and got onto the embankment, started going up a hill, and saw a grove of trees in front of me, and I thought, I'll crash into them, but at least there aren't other cars involved. And just as I got to the top of the hill, the car stopped. And it was perched on top of, the point of this hill, so much so that I thought if I open the door to get out, the car is going to flip over on its head. And just then someone came from one of the trucks who had stopped and helped me out of the car. But before I got out of the car, as my heart was pounding, I had the clear message, Swamiji is my guru, Swamiji is my guru. And people have asked if he knew this was going to happen, why didn't he just tell me to stay home? But my understanding is that with karma, or the consequences from past actions, karma cannot be avoided, it can be modified. So I think that my sense is that something was supposed to happen, that I may have been in a much more serious accident, but through the grace and intervention of the guru and the timing, if it had been 5 seconds off, 10 seconds off, it could have been a very serious accident. So that's one of a number of examples of the ways that I feel protected by Swamiji. It also captures the flavor of the fierceness of his lessons. There's nothing gentle. Now, Ammachi, on the other hand, the hugging saint, she inspires me because of her unconditional love, an easy term to bandy around, but she demonstrates it. If you go to see her, she sits for 18, sometimes 20 hours at a time, embracing people who line up to come to get her darshan. And when she comes to the 200th or 2000th person, there is no detectable change in her level of freshness and love. It's as though each person is a long-lost son or daughter, and she couldn't be happier to see them. And from an external point of view, you see the hugging, but that's clearly not the important part. The important part is that she uses that as her means of transmitting spiritual energy. And from Karunamayi, another saint I've been to see, I feel like she has taught me a lot about Sanskrit and about pujas, or the Hindu form of ritual worship, and she's created wonderful audio tapes so that you can get the pronunciation right, and she also is another gentle, loving, extraordinary soul. All of them here to uplift us, I think. Also, Swamiji is a musician, and when I first went to see him, I didn't know that. And I was completely smitten by the silence and peacefulness that I felt in his presence. But the effect was magnified extraordinarily when I heard him play music. And he has said, music is my religion. And music for me has always been extraordinarily important. It's probably the most intimate part of me, in some sense, what I love most deeply. So that also is part of my connection with Swamiji. And there's one other saint that I went to see who is, his name is Viswamiji, and this is a stretch even for me, that he is said to be an incarnation of Dattatreya, which is almost like the Hindu equivalent of the Trinity in Christianity. It's the combination of Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. And Swamiji Sachchidananda is also an incarnation of Dattatreya. So when I heard through a friend that he was coming to Austin, was only going to be here for about an hour or so, I went to see him. And he is a poet and a writer. And when I met with him, through the suggestion of the friend who brought me there, he said, why don't you ask if you can ask him some questions? And I said, well, I really don't have anything to say. And he said, well, ask him for blessings for your book and for the publication of your book. So I went into a room and had a private meeting with him and asked him that, and he became quite animated, and he said, oh, you're a writer. And upon hearing those words, I thought, oh my goodness, maybe I am a writer. I really had never thought that I was a writer before. And he said that he would give his blessings for the book and the publication. And I feel that certainly it's been blessed. It's been a wonderful adventure.